Morning, everyone here in the room. Some good afternoon or late evening in Europe. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're very happy to have you in the room so close to the holidays, joining us for the launch of the booklet. Let me start off by underlining that we acknowledge and respect the Kwangan peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Kwame, and the Sanish peoples whose historical relationship with this land continues to this day. And I think this land acknowledgement speaks to the historical relationships that are deeply embedded in practices, or in colonial practices that shape realities in Canada until today, but also local practices. And that's something that we will address with this booklet, is how seemingly abstract memories have real implications on the ground, that they shape local practice and they're reproduced through these local practices. So I think this land acknowledgement, beyond acknowledging where we are, is very pertinent to what we discussed today and what we've tried to do in this booklet. So those of you who don't know me, my name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm the director of the Center for Global Studies here at the University of Victoria. And I'm also have had the pleasure of leading the network that has contributed to the production of our booklet, using the past to define the present. So as you can imagine, this is the fruit of labor of many who have contributed, whose wisdom and expertise we've been able to rely on. And this network is called the Germany Network and European North American Perspectives on Commemorating and Addressing Past Injustices, and it is partly financed by the Erasmus Plus program by the European Union. And let me take this opportunity also to thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation Ottawa, who's been generously supporting us in producing this booklet, in particular with a German-Canadian perspective. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't see you all online, but I think Annika Weikenes and Christina Webb from the CAS Foundation Canada are with us. So thank you very much to Ottawa for your support. I thought about a round of introduction, but it might take too long, looking at, you here in the room, but maybe, once we get into discussion, we can introduce ourselves. So let me just give you a little bit of background on what we've been doing with this project and the booklet. And then in a way, this is a kind of a soft launch because, to be honest, we distributed this booklet already before at our October conference. It has been available online, but we thought it's, the pre-Christmas season now is a good occasion to come together here with our local community and our virtual community associated with our project to celebrate and to showcase a little bit what I think is one of the highlights of our collaboration, to think creatively about a very complex topic and how you could make it accessible in a way for particular younger audiences. How do you, almost impossible task, and we will hear from some who have been involved in producing this, and it took much longer than we thought, but there was a reason for this. The reason is that we realized, to squeeze, in a way, a form of collective memory of national context into 2, 3, or 4 pages, how challenging this could be. And so we've gone back and forth and consulted with lots of people that have helped us to produce what you see in front of you. And if you think about the motivation, it's probably that on the one hand, what we see is, I'm not sure if that's the right way of framing it, but a revival of history in terms of shaping current public discourse, our political identities in the 21st century. We see a very popular use of tropes and historical narratives to position contemporary actors, to think about the political imaginary of our contemporary societies. And at the very same time, you see that some of the audiences of those, constructions or narratives of the past don't have a very solid understanding or knowledge of this. And maybe just one figure that I found astounding that, discussed with my students in class is that according to a BBC study from 2019, it was only 1/5 of young people between 18 and 35 in France it said they had no idea what the Holocaust is. So 20% of the respondents, right? It gives you a sense that while the narrative of the commemoration of communism, of fascism, of the Holocaust is still so prominent in our public discourse and often used, the actual knowledge about this is partly also due to fake news. Social media is not very solid, let me put it like this, and subject to manipulation, very easy way of misleading people in their understanding. It also has to do with the very fact that we are at a critical juncture in terms of memory politics. We can decreasingly rely on eyewitnesses, right? Those who lived through the dramatic period of the 20th century, fascism, the Holocaust, but also later communism. The eyewitnesses speaking to this first-hand experience are no longer readily available. So we rely more and more on media representations of these stage, and it becomes difficult for younger people to get a full sense of what is at stake, how you should put certain facts into a political context. So when we thought about how do we actually put this together, right? What are the main themes when we conceptualize this booklet that you have in front of you? I think we went to allow for a comparative dimension. We focus on two key elements. The first one being looking at past injustices and the enormous significance that these have in contemporary society. That's a level of comparison where we could point out of how crucial acknowledging, addressing these past injustices is for the health of our democracies, their attempt to become more inclusive, to become more mature in many respects, to deal with things that often have been neglected, also for power reasons. And that is a dimension that allowed us in particular to link what is happening here in the Canadian context to the European one, thinking about, in my view, a fundamental change in public attitudes towards the legacy of colonialism here. At least there is a greater willingness to address past injustices in the Canadian context, and then critically think about what we do with this truth coming out of often dramatic discoveries of violence, of what the TRC termed a cultural genocide that was orchestrated towards Indigenous people. So what do we do with it? How do we move towards reconciliation? This fundamental task of mastering the past. And I'm not sure that we have Elder Ira Provost at the moment online. He helped us tremendously. I want to thank him for his critical review of our book, and also Callie Bannister. I'm not sure if she's here, but so we needed also these outside perspectives of thinking about how do we represent this, and that gave us a good comparative lens to look at how European societies have addressed this, partly the Holocaust. But you look into this, one other context which we haven't covered in the booklet would be Spain, and how the findings of those mass graves that haven't been acknowledged or marked, it has been catalytic and crucial for Spanish democracy now reaching a new point of addressing its own authoritarian past. So I think that is a critical dimension of memory. And the second point here is that one is looking at past injustices, how they're being used and how they're addressed in contemporary society. And the second dimension that we thought would be good to focus on and use in a comparative lens was to think about how historical narratives are currently being used to legitimize particular political projects. And I'm not sure, that would be one hypothesis that in a way is also guiding us in our larger project in this booklet, is to suggest that we're coming to the end of a particular historical narrative that has guided European politics after the war, the kind of anti-fascist consensus that was built on the commitment to learning from the Holocaust, to think about democracy having this foundation of rejecting totalitarian suggestions. What we see at the moment across Europe is at least an attempt to challenge this form of consensus and to rethink what democracy is all about, often from a more authoritarian, exclusionary nationalist approach. And that is probably in its most extreme form. And we have Alina on the call here. She will speak to this in a second. In its most extreme form, we find this in the current war that has been launched by Russia against Ukraine to use the 20th century memory, the legacy of fascism, the achievements of the Great Patriotic War, as it's called, to justify its aggression in Ukraine. And here you see these terms that are being thrown around, fascist Nazis, fighting Nazis, defending democracy, and so forth, fascism, totalitarian rule. It is for political purpose that these historical narratives are being exploited and instrumentalized in contemporary debates and conflicts. So we try to capture some of this. What we've also realized, and that probably speaks to the success of all those who've been involved in producing this booklet, that we're approaching, why don't you do this for other countries? Where is Italy in this? Right? We just have a kind of a neo-fascist government, right? So it will be interesting to look at memory politics in this country. What about a country like Russia and Ukraine, right? It would be fabulous to add this, or could we translate this booklet? So this is just an example, I think, of something that resonates, I think, with audience in different countries, although very specific in their national context. There is, I think, a shared interest and also concern about the use of history in contemporary politics and how it plays out in the 21st century, the memory of those very dramatic events, mostly from the 20th century. What I would hope to do is to briefly reflect on both, right? So the relevance of what we try to address in this booklet. Memory politics, using the past to define the present in different national contexts, but also the pedagogical aspect of this. Because as you could tell, this is not a peer-reviewed article that we normally work on and get our credit for, but that is a deliberate attempt to think about a different kind of audience for whom maybe our academic writing is not so accessible easily, and something that would spark the interest and maybe the enthusiasm of younger generations. So it wasn't only about dealing with the content of what we did here, but also finding a format that makes it appealing, accessible, and not losing the complexity of the issue. So that, I can tell you, took lots of hours of discussion. Some of the call have been part of it. Hopefully not too frustrated about how things evolved, but we needed the time to do this right. So I would like to invite, we start off with you, Beata, if it's okay. Beata Halicka from Poznan University, who is one of our collaborators and partners in the broader EU network, Jean Monnet network. And I asked Beata to reflect a bit. Her work is on German-Polish relationship, in particular, the difficult legacy of the 20th century in the country's relationship, but also, Beata, you've worked with different agencies outside of the university to think about how to address this in different forms of commemoration. So could I hand it over to you, Beata, to share some of your insights and your perspective coming from the European side of things?
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning, good evening, everybody. It's evening here in Poland. First of all, I want to congratulate everybody who was involved in working on this booklet. I like it very much. I could first work with this or just have a look on the digital form of it. And then after I arrived in Victoria, we got this in the printed form. And I think both are really very good done, especially the dynamic, how dynamic the text and pictures and this whole concept. I think it's really very well done. and this digital form, which is connected with so many additional information, I can imagine it is really a very good tool to work with young people, and I'm going to use it also in my work. So once again, congratulations. And short remark maybe on what inspired me also to prepare this short presentation today is my experience from Victoria October conference. I was very happy to be able to be invited to participate in this and have learned a lot. And one of those interesting thoughts for me, experience, was dealing with word reconciliation, because first being in Victoria, participating in the conference, I could really very deep understand what does it mean for people in Canada, this word reconciliation. I was involved in the process of Polish-German reconciliation for many years. So there are some similarities, but also many differences. And this is one example just to what we could use or present also in this booklet. It is how very special processes like reconciliation are discussed or are subject of discussing in different countries. So my idea was to talk to you shortly today about the reconciliation on Polish-German border. And this is something what was essential for the relation between both countries. As you know, Poland and Germany are situated in the center of Europe, and also the history of both countries plays, I would say, a central role for European Union today. And very strong, good Polish-German relations are especially important today in the situation of the war in Eastern Europe. I would say the history of Polish-German relation, it is a history of good neighborly relation over the centuries, but also a history of conflict and wars, especially in 20th century, with the First and Second World War, which were very tragic, and Poland has been occupied by Nazi Germany for more than 5 years. On the territory of Poland, the most part of Holocaust took place. Many Polish cities has been destroyed by Germans bombing and by the other acts of aggression. More than 5 million people have been killed on the territory of Poland. So at the end of the war, Polish-German border has been shifted to the west. Millions of German civilians have to fly from the Soviet army or were later expelled by Poles. So knowing all these facts, it is so difficult to guess that the Polish-German relation after World War II were not easy, they were very difficult. And it took many years until both nations were able to start a dialogue and the way of reconciliation. It was difficult because Germany had been divided in West capitalist and East communist German states, and Poland became part of Soviet bloc. And even if big part of Polish citizens were against this being Soviet here. And since the early post-war period, German-Polish relations were strong influenced by politics of memory, which differed in West in the East of Europe. Under pressure of Soviet Union, Poland kept good relation with Eastern Germany, which has created a myth of anti-fascism. And generally, myths are a very important tool in memory politics. And Eastern Germany presented themselves as an anti-fascistic state and communistic, and it held West Germany responsible for World War II. And on the other side, West Germany was dominated for a long time by conservative politics of revisionism, aiming in getting back lost territories in the East. And first in the late 1960s, with Social Democrats and the Prime Minister Willy Brandt, this politics has changed and brought first steps toward reconciliation with Eastern neighbors, not only with Poland. So the way of reconciliation was not easy because West Germany still didn't recognize Polish-German border. For Soviet and Polish communists, antagonistic relations with West Germany were needed to keep Polish dependence on Soviet Union. But among Polish conservatives opposition, which was very weak and actually unable to act officially, or more or less had to act secretly in the structures of Catholic Church in Poland. So for this conservative opposition, there was already a need to reconcile with the Germans. So important step was done by Polish bishops, Catholic bishops, who wrote a letter to German bishops in 1965. And in this letter, this official letter was written, "We forgive and ask for forgiveness." And this it was, of course, a very long letter, but this was the main important statement. And this invitation for reconciliation found only little recognition in West Germany, and a lot of criticism on the side of Polish communists. So this difficult way of reconciliation had to wait at least 20 years. So in the late 60s, it was not so really so far. And first, after 1989, 1990, with the unification of two German states, with recognition of Polish-German border, with Polish-German Friendship Treaty of 1991, normal relation could start. And with this political change, also the politics of memory has changed. Many German historians started to investigate what happened in Poland during Nazi occupation, not only in context of Holocaust, which was at that time already very well researched, but also what happened with ethnic Poles and other national groups which were depraved by the Nazis at the time of World War II. And reckoning with the crimes of Nazi Germany has in Poland a longer history. German crimes in Second World War were central to researching its history during the communist era already. And after 1989, new topics were added, such as the flight and expulsion of the Germans, the role of the Polish population in it, and another important topic became the involvement of Polish citizens in Holocaust. And this was a kind of more or less critical dealing with the history on the Polish side. Most Poles were victims of brutal German occupation, but at the same time, they could find themselves in the role of bystanders, beneficiary bystanders, as well as collaborators or even perpetrators of Holocaust. Some Poles helped Jews in different ways, risking their lives. So we had really started a discussion, which is very difficult and still keeping in Poland. Already, we started it in the 1990s. And this kind of critical dealing with our own history was very important for Polish society, even if many topics remained controversial. So critical discussions took also place between German and Poles on a very different level. So not only historians, politicians and intellectuals keep this dialogue or started the dialogue, but also teachers who initiated many exchange programs about history. Also Polish inhabitants of former German cities and towns who started to discover German history of their little homeland, new homeland now, and were ready to meet former German inhabitants. So this process of exchange of school pupils, of inhabitants of small regions were very, very important. And as Poland became member of EU, it received financial support, for example, for Euro regions to cover cost of different German-Polish initiatives, which led to reconciliation. So this is a very interesting moment and interesting process. And a lot could be done. I was very strongly involved in such an initiatives at that time, work especially with students and young people. And I could see how important it is just to give possibility to people from both countries to meet, especially with witness of World War II, and exchange their point of view, their experiences, and give young people this ability to discuss, to take part in such a discussion. So about 2010, we started to speak about normality in Polish-German neighborhood, and our reconciliation process has been showed in other countries as a kind of successful example. Unfortunately, the rising of right-wing populist parties in both countries stopped this process and brought, or in some case stopped this process and brought significant change. Since 2015, Polish right-wing government has implemented a new politics of history and emphasis very strong on national identity and the use of collective memory in nationalistic populist mobilization. And a part of it is funding for reparation for World War II losses, which the peace government has been discussing with Germany for several years. And this year, in September 1st, the Polish government presented a report which showed the total amount of demanding total amount of losses as a kind of preparation for demanding the reparation. And the government assumed that those demands for reparation will strengthen their party's position in the upcoming parliamentary election, and started with an intensified propaganda campaign in the country. So it was in big part done for their own population. Germany rejects any commitments to pay reparation and indicating that Poland gave them up in 1953. This is one of the arguments. I am not a specialist in international law, but I rely on the experts' opinion of lawyers who state that the waiver for further reparation by the People's Republic of Poland in 1953 closed the way for further subsidies. So this is unfortunately because Poland could not act entirely freely at that time and was dependent on the Soviet Union. However, the international law remains valid. As already mentioned, I have been involved in the Polish-German reconciliation process for many years. We have done a lot to keep the dialogue between the two nations, but the process has been not finished. And under the rule of peace party in Poland, the dialogue became very difficult. For me, much more important than demanding the reparation is keeping on the dialogue. Germany invested a lot in dealing with the responsibility for Holocaust, but the majority of German society knows very few about crimes of Germans on not Jewish civilians in East Central Europe during World War II. For years, it has been claimed that the vast majority of Germans are unaware of the extent of material destruction and crimes committed against Polish citizens. So it is often claimed that Germany has done exemplary reckoning with the Nazi past. And it is true that a great attempt of reckoning with the Holocaust and German responsibility for this have been done. But it is not the whole history of World War II. How many Nazi criminals were convicted? What about the reckoning with the occupation of Poland, but also occupation of today Ukraine or Belarus? There is still a lot to do in order to spread knowledge about the history of the Second World War in Eastern Europe. And before I conclude, let me give you one example. Polish government published a report about Polish losses during World War II in September, as I mentioned it, and it wrote also a diplomatic note to the German government, but it didn't formulate his demand for reparation in it. So in this note was only written about the need to make for the awareness about Nazi crimes on Polish territory among German society. So this also shows us that this was much more for their own publicity, the Polish people not really demanding for reparation. And then, as mentioned before, German government refused any discussion about this possible repatriation, but it at least recognized the necessity to do more to spread knowledge about the history of Second World War in Eastern Europe. And it took many years until German's parliament achieved the majority and could accept the project of a monument commemorating all victims of German occupation on Polish territory. And it has been accepted now two years ago. And next to the monument, a center of Polish-German dialogue should be founded soon. So it is an important step, a new step to continuing of Polish-German reconciliation. About the monument, it is still not known where the monument in Berlin will be put up, but it is already accepted by the German parliament. And this example shows that the reconciliation is a long-term process, depending on political situation and international relation. Also, politics of memory is changing, and new topics and aspects receive new relevance and have to be discussed anew. So crucial is that both sides remain open for the dialogue, and that also young people will be involved in the dialogue. So I think it is also in this case, or what we are doing in this project, and also this digital and printed booklet, what we discussed today, is a good tool for keeping this dialogue. And I can imagine, I am sure we will use it also in this keeping this Polish-German dialogue in the future. And I also support very much the idea to translate this booklet into Polish and German, not only to have it in English, in the hope it can be much better received also here in the country on the both sides on the river Odra. Thank you very much. I can hear. No, we don't hear it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you, Beata, for such a vivid account of the challenges, but also partly the progress that has been made in the, you call it the reconciliation process between Canada and, Germany and Poland. And, I was very pleased to hear that how you opened your statement to say, what you learned from coming here to the conference is a greater understanding of the challenges and the issues at stake in the Canadian context, dealing with the legacy of colonialism and the treatment of Indigenous peoples. And while it is so different, right? You could see that certain issues about how do you come to the knowledge, and you did describe that even 80, 90 years after the facts, there's still facts to produce, knowledge to be had. So it is an ongoing process to uncover and make publicly available facts, the truth about these past injustices that for very understandable and logical reasons have been tried to conceal by those in power and those responsible. And also how challenging it is then to move towards a form of reconciliation, what actors it would need to do this properly. And I think it's not by accident that the TRC put education and education institutions in the center of a long-term reconciliation process in the Canadian context. And so if we could contribute a little bit to it by basically getting the attention of younger people in high school, maybe beginning of university, I think that will be a good step. So think about it for taking us to Europe for a little while and to realize the ongoing challenges, right? Although it's a European Union, now decades of attempts to bring two very different constituencies together, these historic topics linger, and they are being also used and instrumentalized in contemporary politics. You briefly alluded to this as well. Maybe before we come to you, Alina, could I ask Lawrence, Lawrence has been, Lawrence Clausen is an MA, has an MA from the University of British Columbia, and he was kind enough to join us for much of the production of the booklet. So Lawrence, I hope you have recovered from this collective endeavor. It has been a long process that we thought we would complete much earlier, but thank you for joining us, Lawrence. Maybe you could speak a little bit about the production and what has gone into this from your perspective, because this was mainly done by younger people, as it should be, right? So their perspective, and it was, you will see in I think the first page of the booklet, you see all the people that have been involved and provide us with guidance as well. So many thanks again at this stage. But Lawrence, maybe you could, on behalf of this large group, one of your students, interns, can reflect a bit on your experience with the product.
Sure. Thanks, Oliver. I'm happy to be here today to speak about it. And yeah, like you mentioned, it was a pleasure to work on the booklet, but it also was a little bit of a task. It took a lot longer than we were expecting. And it was a lot more difficult actually to write out what certainly at the beginning I thought would be, oh, I'm German, I know about the Holocaust, it's difficult, but we'll sum it up and we'll work it out. But once you start to really go over it and think about the language, it was a lot more challenging than I think any of us in the writing team had a sense of. And I just want to also thank, I was working on this, but Oliver and Beate were as well as Fazila, who I see is in the audience, and Anne-Katrine as well, who can't be here today. So I think it was really a great team effort, and I was really proud and happy to work with everyone. And I've been asked today to speak a little bit about how young people acquire knowledge on memory politics and history, and just generally how history is taught and learned, and some of the changing patterns and pedagogies involved. So I'll try to keep it brief. I'll try to be somewhat short so we can get plenty of time for questions and discussion. Thank you so much, Beate and Oliver, for introducing things. Everyone can hear me all right? Fine, right? Great. So thinking about how young people learn about history, I really think it's sort of two main obvious sources, right? There's education and culture. So there's the school system, there's history class, which all of us sit through at some, in some extent and at some point in our lives. And then there's movies and TVs and songs and stuff like that. And each of them obviously have their shortcomings. So when you're sitting in the classroom and you're learning about history, as I'm sure all of us to various degrees experienced, as I said, the teacher and the school system spends so much time getting you to learn the basic facts, sort of getting the script of whatever country or whatever national context you're learning about. Like, oh, you have to know about the French Revolution, and then, oh, of course, the First World War and the Second World War. And they're so focused on just kind of getting you literate enough in the history of whatever country or part of the world you're from, that they often don't really have the time, or understandably, they can't really be too concerned about the afterlife of history, right? Like, well, okay, all these events, all this history happened, but then what came after? What were the debates? What was the historiography? How was this history used? They might touch on it a little bit in terms of monuments and the sort of remembering of battles and stuff like that. But in the history classroom, they're really just, we have a syllabus to go through. That's been my experience, certainly in school. And that's sort of the pattern for a lot of education systems, certainly in the Western world. That again, it's really a shame that they can't really talk about the memory politics after history is made, as it were. And of course, I don't need to speak a lot about culture, but I'm sure we all know that movies and TV shows aren't always interested in complex narratives. So sometimes people walk away with obviously there's varying degrees of this with movies. Some do a really great job, but generally culture can be a very iffy way to learn about the complexities and nuances and subtleties, especially because movies always have, for the most part, a really clear hero villain narrative, which sort of goes against the whole purpose of memory politics, which again is the subtleties and the manipulations of the historical process. So you have all that going on, and I think it's unsurprising then that for most people, for most young people, for most students, the main dynamics are a balance of extreme apathy and sort of ignorance is the wrong word, but maybe stubborn confidence is maybe a better way of saying it. I think I'm personally convinced that most young people don't really care about history. That's certainly been my experience growing up in this generation and most of the young people I engage with. And if they do, it will be maybe like an aesthetic interest, like, oh, I love the Romans or I love World War II stuff. But it won't really be a sort of profound intellectual interest, which is, again, understandable. If you've been sitting in a classroom and it's just been jammed in your head all day, most people are not going to come away with a sort of deep passion for history, like weirdos like me and everyone else who worked on the Booklet project. So, but there's this apathy, and then there's also this comfortable confidence, as I said. Like, I think most people would also feel, certainly with their national contexts, like, if you're English, you might feel, oh, I know the English story, I know what kind of country we are, we're a force for good. Maybe the United States is an even better example of this, because that's sort of that moralistic, oh, we're a force for good, we defeated the Nazis, we defeated the communists. That's a sort of comfortable narrative you can latch onto. And obviously I'm massively generalizing. Every young person in a lot of different contexts will have their own version of this. But I think if you don't have apathy, young people, if anything, will have their narratives that they hold on to. And those can be negative narratives as well. They don't necessarily have to be positive. So again, returning to the United States, a lot of young people these days might have the opposite thing, where they're convinced the United States is evil and it's always been a force for evil. And it's slavery and it's colonialism, and of course the truth is somewhere in between those two extremities. But yeah, I think it's a little bit of a misconception that young people are always very tolerant and liberal and very understanding of the nuances of things. Sometimes in my experience, they can be very passionate, and they can be very, again, self-assertive, and that can apply to their understanding of history as well. So this is starting to change, and like Oliver touched on, I think the discussions and the discourses around colonialism and the imperial past and remembrance, all of that sort of intellect, all that stuff is in the zeitgeist, as it were. So I think it's become very normal for young people, for kids and older, to really challenge the narratives that they're being presented with, or at least have a vague sense that the past is a complicated place. Because certainly within my recent lived experience, the way history is talked about, even if just very tangentially, is it been absolutely in flux. And I think, again, even if you're apathetic or very confident, you're going to absorb some of that. So as these discourses of, these complicated legacies are being exchanged and tossed around, I do think there is starting to break into the way young people think, this possibility that things are more complicated and there is nuance to these stories. Although maybe that is the optimistic view, who knows. But at the very least, I think we can say a culture of questioning and critically examining things that once were taken for granted is definitely prevalent in Western cultures. And I think in the long run, that's promising. But of course, there are certain dangers and challenges to the contemporary context. Fake news has become, a buzzword of the generation. And of course, challenging and questioning things is all well and good, but we've all, I think all in our own lives and our own work have seen the sort of dark side of that, the conspiratorial mind frame that can take over sometimes, when everything is questioned and everything is a conspiracy and there's a sort of deeper hidden meaning to things, when the truth might be more or less established. And as a historian myself, I feel very strongly that certain things can and are known, and to sort of consider them from new perspectives is always worthwhile, but to question their veracity can be very harmful, especially when we're dealing with painful traumas like the Holocaust or what happened to First Nations in Canada or similar traumas. It's one thing to discuss them, but to have to question their veracity again, or to sort of think that there is some hidden conspiracy behind that can be challenging, and that needs to be navigated. Because again, I think it's sort of naive to assume all young people are, you know, inherently friendly and cuddly with how they respond to all these narratives. You know, certainly that's not the case in the United States, in my experience. And also there's fading remembrance, which is something we talked a lot about in the booklet, and something was a real driver for writing it in the first place. You know, remembering something like the Holocaust can be a lot more difficult and complicated if there's less survivors around to talk about it. And it just becomes less prevalent in lived memory. So as the traumas of the 20th century start to fade, there is always that doubt that people will stop caring, and young people of successive generations will take that education, that remembrance less and less seriously, especially if this zeitgeist of questioning and critically examining kind of continues unabated. And then finally, you know, the resurgence of nationalism is also really prevalent. I mean, with the case studies we used in the booklet, with all of them, there's that sort of either directly stated or implied context of, but I believe we stated it for all five. There are political forces in all these countries that are much more aggressively promoting a kind of narrow-minded nationalism than has been seen in recent decades. And again, nationalism itself, being proud of your country, is not detrimental to memory politics, but if it's a nationalism that shuts down, you know, if it's a nationalism that is very hostile to any perceived threat or any perceived criticism of the nation, like history is full of, then that's when you start to get into trouble. And you'll have maybe people who subscribe to these views in Italy or Germany or Poland or France, and a new generation of young people who, if they've been raised in a political culture of sort of ultranationalism, they might be less willing to accept the notion that Germany or Italy or Poland or France, wherever, you know, quote unquote, evil or harmful countries, even though these are obviously morally loaded terms. And so, yeah, just to close, just to finish, again, I'm not stating anything, I'm not reinventing the wheel, I'm not stating anything crazy, but I think this is where a very strong, balanced education, a very bottom-up education is the only real solution. You know, in the climate of fake news and conspiracy, people have somehow been talking about, people in politics and in education have been talking a lot about internet literacy and sort of information literacy, like teaching kids how to navigate what is a sort of legitimate source, or at least how to spot manipulative content and social media conspiracy theories. And I kind of feel something similar has to happen with history, where I've gone into arguments with people in my life a lot where I don't think it's that complicated to accept that history is complicated, that, you know, there are not clear villains and clear angels in any place you look. I don't think that's a very complicated message. And I think if communicated correctly, young people will sort of take it on. But that's not really been, as I said, the focus of education systems thus far. They've really been syllabus oriented. And I think the syllabus is all well and good, and kids, I mean, I'm a massive history fan, so I think people should know about their past. But as they get taught that, they also need to be taught how to interpret it and some of the dangers of how memory politics are used and abused. And that, hopefully this booklet is one small step in that direction. So yeah, I think that about covers it. You're still muted. Still muted, I think.
Good. Okay. Now better.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yes.
No, thank you very much for all the passion as you call the history fan you brought to the project with our other collaborators, and your reflection on the role of education here, but also the passion that young people have brought to questioning our established way of looking at history. And with the Black Lives Matter movement, you can see how history, the legacy of colonialism in particular, has become a subject of politicization, also of engaging young people in the debate of what history is all about, right? And that's something I find across the Atlantic, right? In the Canadian context, but also in the European ones, where European societies now, after more than a century, start looking at their own legacy of colonialism, looking at naming of streets, of monuments, and so forth. So there seems to be an international movement, particularly driven by younger people, to in a way question what we've taken for granted or simply ignored in terms of the long-term impact of colonial rule and colonial conquest in Europe and in Canada. So thanks very much for this, Lawrence, and I hope you find that this booklet adds a bit to you what you see as necessary to get people, young people in particular, to a point of critically thinking about history and its use. And that's, I think, what we've tried to do, not facts, but also leading the audience, the reader, into critical reflection on what they've learned from the different national contexts. Wonderful. Last but definitely not least, I would like to invite Stova from Ghent University, where she is doing currently Marie Curie Fellowship on memory politics, on monuments more specifically in the former Soviet Union, the territory in Eastern Europe. And Alina, I thought we'd bring you in to speak to one of the most dramatic contexts of how history or memory is being used at the moment in Europe to also underline the urgency of the issues that we've been dealing with in this project. And if you could take us a little bit now back to Europe and speak to what is happening in Ukraine and Russia and the use of 20th century memory in this respect, before I open it up for questions. And Alina has been a loyal guest and contributor to our network over the last 2 or 3 years. Sorry you couldn't come to Victoria. We have to bring you out at some stage. But it's wonderful that you can contribute today from Belgium through Zoom. So Alina, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, many thanks for your invitation, and many thanks for this opportunity to speak again about memory politics and in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine. I'm originally from Ukraine. I'm a Ukrainian citizen, so things which are going on in Ukraine is something which really affects me. Congratulations on your booklet. This is a nice guidelines, I think, and a nice introduction to memory policies, to histories. It's like an invitation to learn more about history and about current memory politics. And I think that this is just the beginning of the bigger project. And I think that you can expand the scope of this booklet, adding UK studies. And for instance, I would be happy to contribute with a chapter or with a paragraph, I don't know how to call it, an electronic booklet, which is devoted to Russia and Ukraine. The next slide, please. I was asked today to reflect on the question why are historical narratives are so important for Russia at the moment. And I will try to explain why Russia is so preoccupied with history and why Russia is so aggressive in defending official truth. And I think that in case of Russia, the past is not about shaping the present, it's about destroying the present, unfortunately. And also I would like to prove that this question, why is Russia so preoccupied with their history, this question is right to be asked, is the right question to be asked. And first I will share with you the latest news about Russia's memory politics. Then I will give some explanations about Russia's historical narrative of the Great Patriotic War, and then very briefly overview of Russia's legislation. So the next slide, please. Here, I would like to start with 2 quotes. The first one belongs to Putin, and this quote is from his essay on historical unity between Russians and Ukrainians. To better understand the present and to look into the future, we must turn to history. I should stress that in his essay, Putin used history to deny the right of Ukraine to exist. So he was claiming that Ukraine is an artificial state which was created by Bolsheviks on the so-called Russia's historical lands. But to understand Russia's memory politics, we should refer to a quote from George Orwell's 1984, who controls the past, controls the future, who controls the present, controls the past. It was a motto of the so-called the Ministry of Truth, and I think that Russia is a country which has almost created its own Ministry of Truth. But first, let's share, I would like to share with you the latest news. Please, next slide. News number one. It happened yesterday. The first news is about Russian legislation process. It's about the State Duma. Yesterday, it adopted a law to amend the federal law on the state language. So these amendments were admitted in the first reading, but I think that these amendments will become law. And the idea of these amendments is to protect Russian language against foreign words. So this law bans the use of foreign words in Russian language if there is a Russian alternative to this foreign word. So it's kind of protection against linguistic intervention from the West. This is first news. And second news, again, it happened yesterday. Yesterday, Putin ordered the government to start working on popularization of Russian history and heroes, including heroes from Russian folklore, to promote the so-called traditional Russian values. So according to Putin, history should be taught starting from kindergarten, and it means that the government has to develop some special program to start educating kids in the kindergarten, teach them history. And second thing about using heroes from folklore is very interesting, because that Putin was kind of sad about Russian bogatyrs, Russian heroes from folklore. He said that Batman is famous, but our bogatyrs are not. They have to be featured in cartoons and movies, in children's literature. These images have to be multiplied, repeated, and be a foundation of what? Maybe of society. It means that very soon we will see that Russian fairy tales, legends, epics, folklore will be used to legitimize historical narratives and to legitimize geopolitical claims of the Russian Federation. So history is not enough to use for political purpose, and the next step is to use Russian fairy tales, epics, and folklore. So as for the current situation, let's move to this. Yes, next slide, please. As for the current situation and as for the Great Patriotic War narrative, this narrative is used to legitimate power in the present, to legitimate geopolitical ambitions in the region, geopolitical ambitions of the Russian Federation. The Great Patriotic War narrative is Russian interpretation of World War II. In this narrative, everything for the Soviet Union started not on the 1st of September 1939, but on the 22nd of June 1949. In this narrative, the Soviet Union is a victim of aggression, and at the same time, the Soviet Union is Europe's liberator. This narrative allows to avoid questions about the pre-war cooperation between Hitler and Stalin, about the Pact of Molotov-Ribbentrop, about post-war Soviet occupation. So it's very useful and very simplistic narrative, which has nothing in common with the history. The Soviet Union and Russia, as a continuator of the USSR, defeated Nazi Germany, and it means that a country which defeated the Nazi Germany, a Nazi regime, should have special rights, should be respected, and should enjoy a special treatment, meaning that because that the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany, Russia has some geopolitical interests in the Eastern and Central Europe. This is a first conclusion. And second conclusion, that because Russia defeated the Nazi Germany, Russia cannot be totalitarian country, a totalitarian state, and Russia cannot be blamed for any wrongdoings, for any crimes. Everyone who against Russia is a Nazi or neo-Nazi, and in this historical narrative, Russia's war against Ukraine is considered to be a continuation of the Great Patriotic War. So in this interpretation, Russia now has a war with the West, with Nazi, which is a continuator of the Nazi Germany. So from the historical point of view, this is a craziness, but this is Russia's historical narrative, and this historical narrative is protected by Russia's legislation. Next slide, please. So about legal regulation and legal regulation which proves that Russia is a country which preoccupied with the past, is a country which controls the past and regulates the past. So first of all is a norm of the constitution. This norm was introduced to Russian constitution in 2020 during the so-called constitutional reform of the Russian Federation. According to this article, Russia is a legal successor of the Soviet Union on the territory, and Russia respects the memory of the defenders of the fatherland, and Russia is obliged to protect the historical truth. So according to this constitutional norm, historical truth is a constitutional value which should be protected. Next slide. Russia uses criminal sanctions to protect its historical truth. So the first article which should be mentioned is rehabilitation of Nazism. Article 354(1), criminal responsibility for falsification of history, which means spreading the knowingly false information on the activities of the Soviet Union during World War II. Next slide, please. This law prescribes how the World War II should be remembered. It says that no one should identify the goals and actions of the USSR and Nazi Germany in the World War II. And this law bans also to deny the decisive role of the Soviet people in defeating Nazi Germany and the humanitarian mission of the Soviet Union. So questions about crimes committed by the Soviet Union during World War II, questions about crimes committed by the Red Army are suppressed by this legislation. Next slide, please. This is a list of the so-called Russian days of military glory, and you can see that there are like around 20 days of Russian military glory, and it means that all these historical events cannot be questioned. I mean, the glory of the past cannot be questioned, and if a historian or a citizen questions and has doubts in the greatness of the past, these doubts can be punished by the use of criminal sanctions. Next slide. Article 243 of the Criminal Code punishes destruction or damage of Russian and Soviet military graves and monuments on the territory of the Russian Federation and abroad. So it means that this article has extraterritorial effect. Next one. And Russia is a country which proclaims history as a matter of national security. And to my best knowledge, this is the only one country which treats historical truth and history as a matter of national security. The next one, please. And now we are going to this question from which we started. Why are the historical narratives so important for Russia at the moment? And I think that the answer to this question is related to the source of legitimacy. How a state can legitimate its power. If it is a democracy, its legitimacy is based in the fair elections. Fair elections is a matter of present. Russia doesn't have fair elections. If we will ask a question, what are the achievements of Russia during the last 20 years? What are the achievements of Putin regime? Economical development? No. Happiness of citizens? No. Well-developed system of social security, medicine, education? What has Russia achieved after the collapse of the Soviet Union? And the answer will be nothing. So it means that Russia has nothing in the present, yet in the past, it has an empire and the so-called greatness. So everything which can be used for Russia's greatness is declared the historical truth and protected by law, according to this motto of the Ministry of Truth, who controls the past, controls the present. Thank you very much for your attention. We cannot hear you.
I know.
Okay.
Here we go. Okay. Thank you very much, Alina. It's sobering, but also revealing to hear you talk about how totalitarian regimes often, and not by accident, rely on a glorification of their historic past and how they are being used. And I think, you know, that's, I think, one of those issues that have come up in our collective studies, how democracy and authoritarianism are quite distinct in how they address their past, and that there is an endemic link of authoritarian regimes to, in a way, use, instrumentalize the past for their own purposes. And I think what we see at the moment in Russia is a dramatic effect or way of doing this and using, you know, the glorified past for their expansionist militaristic activities. So thank you for underlining the relevance and almost, the urgency of looking at memory politics in contemporary Europe, but also here in the Canadian context. So with this, let me open up. Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you very much for Beata, Lawrence, and Alina for setting the scene a bit of what we've tried to achieve. You already get a sense, right, of how challenging it is. We picked a couple of national contexts and then try to bring this together with critical incentives for critical reflection on these histories. And that is still an open question, but we will pursue this thinking creatively about how education and educational context could be used for pursuing these questions and training new generations. As Lauren said, right, it is often a challenge to convey the complexity, the importance of history to younger generations. So let me open it up. Any observations or comments or questions that you might have? Could you monitor the screen? Anyone here in the room?
Well, fascinating. Congratulations to all of you, to the team who put this together. And thank you for putting it together. I want to make several comments. One is, I want to thank you for the forum. It's very common for us as academics, to write papers and articles and go to conferences and share our materials in forms which are kind of codified in a way which we understand very well, but nobody else does. So the fact that you took the time, it sounds like you had a lot of difficult conversations to try and take, obviously your skills, your scholarly your insights, but to transform them into a way that is accessible to a broader public is really to be commended. And I really think that this kind of, some people call knowledge mobilization, open access, open, I think that this is a really important part of the relationship between knowledge and democracy. So thank you very much for that. I wanted to just to make one connection. I come out of a field of what different people call transformative adult education, or some countries popular education, which is a space which tries to understand, kind of pedagogical, historical engagement and processes amongst people who are already, adults already involved as citizens. And I recall that in Europe after the Second World War, a very important organization was created called the European Association for Adult Education. And they created something called Meeting in Europe. And it was a space where, former, Germany and former allies and former, countries that were opposed to each other, Italy and others, and semi-neutral countries like Spain and Switzerland were all able to get together and spend some time, in conversations, quite deep conversations, that to underscore, what their commonalities are. And this field, this sort of transformative, adult education discourse has continued to this day. And there is an organization called ESTRIA, European Association for the Study of Adult Education, and they are very interested in in this very topic, of the use of memory and how, and their focus, but they are not specialists necessarily in history. They are specialists in the engagement of the conversations and the pedagogical effects. And so I'd be happy, to chat with, to provide some linkages to people I know who are interested, who would love to be in dialogue with you going forward. One piece that comes out of that experience that always touches me is that so much of what we do when we try to communicate, when we try to provide, discourses and kind of pathways into historic memory, is quite informational. It's quite didactic and it's quite cognitive. And one of the things that we've been learning over the years is that in order to really have an impact, you also need to engage the emotional very powerfully. And there are a lot of discourses and a lot of people, including people right here at the University of Victoria. You had some young Italian women here not so long ago who talking about that, the use of the arts. So I think that a sort of a companion, sort of piece on this would be to say, okay, here we've got this fantastic new, piece. Now let's design a kind of a sort of a pedagogical with some arts based and the head and the heart kind of thing. But it's a very, very impressive piece of work, and it just couldn't come at a better time. And I share Oliver's observation about the Russian, the way in which thank you so much for that, the way in which Russia is using history to destroy the present is very, but anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, and Bob Hall, for those of you who don't know him, he is the holder of the UNESCO chair and passionate about bringing scholarly knowledge to a broader audience and democratizing knowledge so you can see, and that is in a way also behind our initiative to think, having a broader impact and using the research that we use. Maybe we haven't quite gone beyond the cognitive, but we are struggling with this. But that's because that was part of our consideration. How do young people learn these things, right? And we have two daughters in this age, and we realize they don't necessarily go only through reading and this, but you need to provide different pathways into making education meaningful. Matt, maybe you could briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, Matt James, Political Science Department here at University of Victoria. Nice to see Lauren, Cynthia, and Alina up there on the screen. It's just anybody, if they want to react to it, I'd be interested in what they have to say. But as I was listening to Alina making the point that the kind of relative lack of Russian achievements over the last 20 years kind of fuels a particular kind of really aggressive obsession with memory politics. And so I kind of started thinking, obviously Russian official discourses are not going to admit that. They're going to find achievements, they're going to point to them. And it seems to me that one of the achievements that Russian official sources would emphasize would be what they would kind of present as the successful war in Russia against radical LGBTQ gender ideology, the defense of the traditional family, and so on and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, like in Canada, for example, Canada's apology for historical persecution of sexual minorities gets presented by the Canadian federal government as evidence of Canada's world leadership, being progressive. Scholars talk about homo nationalism, right? Like presenting a country's alleged tolerance and progressiveness around sexual diversity and the rights of sexual minorities as a kind of a nationalist posturing on the world stage. It's used as a kind of form of branding. So anyway, all this gets me to the point that it seems to me that questions of gender and sexual diversity don't get talked a lot in relation to memory politics, but they're there and potentially quite significant in terms of contemporary geopolitical confrontations. So just throwing that out there as something that we want to discuss.
It's a very good point, and I think we've discussed this. I think, Lawrence, you mentioned how historical narratives often operate, with a clear distinction between the friend and the foe, right? The good and the bad, right? The evil that needs to be fought. And it is quite striking how I think authoritarian regimes, but also those who question the legitimacy of particular forms of democracy now focus on a particular group that they suggest, right, undermine, the integrity of the political community, right? And then that's, in the last couple of years, I think that has been a common theme, going from the Western world, just looking down south, what's happening, to regimes in Europe and elsewhere, right? So I think that's a sort of unexplored dimension, right, of the resurgence of nationalist populism, that they often look at minorities, right, and brand them as a source of evil, of degeneration, and Putin does this now very, very directly, right, and very aggressive, and that's something we haven't covered, but it's a very, maybe we should write something on this. Anyone else? What's going? Anyone? Sorry, please. Could you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Matsumi. I'm at Toshiko University, Kyoto, Japan, but right now I'm doing a residency at the University of Victoria. I think I'll be attached to this center.
No, you don't really think so. You definitely are.
Thank you very much for all the presentations, and I presented my talk, and I study about Japanese Canadian and Japanese Americans. And as I was listening to the talk, and I also attended Matt's presentation, which was posted here too, that we have to think about how the memory is used and political aspect of that. And also, as I'm a historian, so digging out the facts and just presenting the fact as fact.
Right.
And so it presents a very, very complex situation, especially in my talk, I talked about how the Japanese Americans are using their historical memory experiences for, in our way, good purposes, that is anti-racist, more liberating. But at the same time, we do have problem with policing that kind of particular experience of Japanese Americans and trying to silence other kinds of their experiences, which is maybe not so useful. So when I'm asked, like, okay, so what is my purpose of digging out all these facts that might not work necessarily for anti-racist political cause, then it's like, what are we doing, right? Or should we even do this? So yeah, so if anyone could comment on this, like other academic historian and also as academic activist. How should we do this?
Thank you, Madhuri. Just try to give me 1 second. Do you raise your?
Yes.
Okay, great. Give me 1 second, because Madhuri, I think raised 2 very important points. One is, should historians reflect what impact the knowledge have that, that they produce, right? Normally, historians believe in just a presentation of facts, but we know that this is not how the world works, right? So there's a reflection on the impact of your work that is on top of your actually historical research. And the other one is, should the public also for good purposes center certain elements, right, that are seen as hurtful, racist, and so where is the line, right, where history crosses something that is seen as legitimate, as hurtful, as demeaning, and so forth, and openly racist, right? So that's a very difficult question, because I think our plea in with this booklet is for an open debate, right, about history. And I think democratic societies distinguish themselves by allowing for this diverse, multi-actor debate about what history is, what should we learn from it, and so forth, right? But are there lines to be drawn in terms of what is legitimate part of public? It's a difficult question, free speech and all this, but we know about this. But thank you for bringing this up for us to take home the Christmas holiday to ponder. Jeffrey, do you want to put this up?
My name is Jeffrey Bird. I'm with Royal Roads University. I'm in the School of Communication and Culture, and certainly happy to be with you all today. It's my first time to be at the center, and long overdue. The kind of work I've done in the past is about remembrance and people's experience at sites of memory. So I've done a lot of work around looking at how heritage sites are managed, the kinds of interpretation that occurs there. And often those places are really quite powerful for people. When they go to a battlefield and they learn the story there. And to your really good question, I think is like how do we remember well is the one that I try to chew on and try to understand, because often what I see is no matter what the interpretation is at the site, the meaning is ultimately co-constructed by one's own lens, and you will make your own interpretation of that landscape. So you may look at the Normandy American Cemetery as an example of when America saved Europe. Other people would see it as an example of why it needs a strong military. Other people would see that it would, so they'll come up with their own interpretations, what I'm trying to say. But there is a whole field of memory policy that I think speaks to this idea of what makes for good memory policy. What is it that we should be doing with this? And because I think the challenge is that when people hold these views so closely, that they can suffer a social death if they are brought to realize what the factual history says. And this can cause people to push back even harder, to fight back, not just to resolve. And the transformative learning is certainly what we're trying to achieve, but it can be very difficult for people to accept that. And I think that is where the debate lies. And I think this is a great start. And my question is, what's part 2? Because I do see that.
I think we're running out of plans now.
So it was wonderful ideas and just really advances, I think, allows us to dig in at a younger age, these questions. And then there's allows us to step into these other ideas.
Thank you, Rafi. And, we kind of come back to, thinking jointly about, is there education or could there be educational policy guiding this process, right? How to commemorate well, right? And hopefully in an inclusive manner. So I think that's a fundamental challenge, right? The one is the intellectual integrity of, us as scientists and researchers reflecting, but is there a role for public authorities, for policymaking to play, right, to guide this process? So that could be the next level. That's what we're always interested in here at the center, right? To think about how could it transpire into informing, public policies and so on. So it's a conversation to be had, also going into the future. So Rafi will be joining us, an adjunct fellow here. So welcome to the center for the first time here on site. That's wonderful. Any comments or questions here? I think we have 5 more minutes or so. But that's exactly the kind of conversation we'll have. It's great to see so many talented and engaged scholars around this table here, and to see, how, you might think, if you have any suggestions where to use, in what context to use and distribute this. We will go into high schools in the new year and present on this. We guide a memory politics study tour to Europe, and when the students come back, they will share their knowledge hopefully at high schools here locally. So that's one of the initiatives. And that would be more. I think probably you've taken groups to signs of commemoration. That is part also of the beyond the cognitive, right? It is about the confrontation. It is, you feel it, right, and you're engaged emotionally far more. And that's what we hope to achieve, taking a group of Canadian students and then trying to share this with group. Because that's, Lawrence, that's exactly the challenge that you described. How do you, in a way, make this appealing and relatable, right, for young people beyond the factual thing, when what happened, right? So, and that's our challenge, but also the beauty of doing this kind of work. Any other?
Could you perhaps share some of the difficulties that you had making?
So sorry, Lynn, do you want to go first? And then we should. Please.
Could say something. I was just thinking if as someone who belongs to perhaps the youngish generation, I think I related to a lot of what Lawrence said about the difficulty of using social media and the loss of the ability to do deep reading that I observe among people of my same age. So there is a huge conflict between the idea of social media as a tool of communication, because I think the fact is some of these very serious issues mentioned by everyone can't be conveyed that easily through bite-sized body character kind of posts. And so it's difficult to convey to people of my age or younger about the importance of just spending the time to sit with your ideas, because I can relate to growing up in an education system where there's not much time to do anything else other than focus on the syllabus. And I think perhaps parents and teachers have a huge role to play in terms of how to react to some of these overscheduled child things that all of us go through these days. And so in relation to listening to Mazumi's past presentations as well, and coming from Asia, I also wonder if there's further collaboration that can be done that kind of perhaps recognizes Japan's role in Asia as an eco-aggressor, kind of like the forgotten Holocaust, for lack of a better term, because the interest of this book is also teaching Canadian students how to think relationally, transnationally about colonial comparative racism and colonial histories. And so I was just thinking if it can be enhanced by broadening the scope of colonial aggressions, perhaps by recognizing what has happened in Asia and perhaps in other regions. And so I guess that's my very hurried response.
Well, thank you. Sounds like a tantalizing, opportunity to think about expanding this truly transnationally beyond the transatlantic dimension that we've covered, right? So it needs deep knowledge, and some of the trust is a controversial history, right? And that we've listened to Beata, right, and how this is even contemporary, government politics, right, using memory for so it is not an easy task. Memory politics is a mind trap, right, for getting things wrong, and so that maybe Beata has been spearheading really this initiative with a booklet. You can speak a little bit to the difficulties that we've encountered.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Beate Schmidtke, and I'm the co-lead of the EUCAnet project, and this production has been really challenging, and it's interesting to hear from colleagues how academic work is challenging and how long it takes to do, your publications. But this was truly the case for us too, because this publication, even though I don't know how many words it has, but it's not so much content inside, has been taking us for almost a year to produce. And it was a team of 10, roughly 10 people, younger scholars, interns, but as well, we involved our Germany network, so the academics that produced the country studies. And it was the biggest task, of course, was to narrow the content and to simplify it as possible, to make it understandable for a younger audience. And that has created a lot of controversies among us, and it was a very difficult process to identify and how to shorten it, what is the most important aspect of the narrative that we want to present. But not just that, we also, thinking about young audiences, very much wanted to make it aesthetically pleasing, pictures, videos, like all kinds of links where kids could just enter or young adults enter and explore the field and not be focused just on the narrative that we present there. So it was pedagogically very much important for us to make an open space for all students. So what we also enjoyed very much, but took a lot of time, is to draft the questions that we put out to young audiences inside, and also to collect the feedback from a lot of different sides. So we realized, even after being so meticulous, careful about how we write it and exploring it among our team, we then invited other scholars to also give us feedback, what created a lot of painful moments, because of course, we have not always done everything perfectly, and then to include this feedback. And in addition, we have a video clip that we are producing for young audiences. It's still not ready, even though it's still 2 years in making. So it's to involve the current issues in a setting that is very complex, but also for a younger audience, it is a bigger challenge, but I think extremely rewarding, as we have seen for the team and maybe for this production. So yes, it's just a start, Geoffrey, and we hope to bring it forward to another level. But yeah, it's always a question of funds and of a team that is available and open-minded to create this knowledge. And I'm extremely happy with all the collaborators that we had. I mean, everybody put their heart in it. So all the authors and all the people have been extremely intense and very much caring about this project. So I think this is why it's such a beautiful production. And our designer, Karen Yin, you've seen the design, allows for so many aesthetic pleasing moments in this brochure. And that's why it's double interesting to explore this whole thing.
And where is it on the internet? Where do we find it?
It's
The link I think we put into it.
side, and it's digitally like a flip book.
Yeah, okay.
So I think we need to wrap up things soon. So yeah, I know, Fran's already leading 1-0, and so I'm sure you guys. Sorry for the bookmark.
Oliver, I'm watching the game after this. Don't spoil.
You're next. And last. Sorry,
okay.
no, it's 2-0 to Morocco. Just to confuse you.
That's all right. That's all right. I just wanted to briefly say the reason I raised my hand was I just wanted to thank Beate for her comments, and I think her leadership was really, really crucial in sort of getting us through the whole process and being super patient. And I think when a lot of times when the writing team wanted to kind of just call it a day and say this section is good enough, Beate was the voice of like, let's make it just a little bit better, just a little bit better. Let's ask one more person. And yeah, and it was frankly hard to work with sometimes, but I really think it was really but it was great leadership, and it made the product what it is. And I just wanted to thank her personally for her role and everything she did.
That's wonderful, Lawrence. I think I was one of those boys that, oh, let's call it a day. And I think there was treasure for the legitimate one in the background there. So thank you all, for joining us, Alina, Beata in particular, and Lawrence, for your presentations. That was wonderful to have you here in the room, virtually at least. And we definitely stay in touch. We have another year in this network, the Money Network grant, and then hopefully we do something else. And thank you all for coming out so briefly before Christmas. It's great to hear from you and your expertise. Many of you contributed to this product, and I think this issue will stay with us, right? And in different forms, we are working on it from different perspectives. We from Asia to Europe to North America. Memory matters, right? And it's fascinating to see how it's being enforced. So thank you for this, and thank you all, and have a great day. And sorry, Lawrence, for
Thank you
ruining
so much.
this. That was
That's all right. I knew the risks. That's all right.
Thank you,
Have a great
everyone.
day, everyone. All the best.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.